Haunted by Rosie, the curse of the porcelain doll. Once upon a time, in a small town nestled deep in the woods, there lived a little girl named Emily. She was a happy child with long curly hair and big brown eyes. She loved to play with her dolls, especially her favourite one, a porcelain doll with a pink dress and a lace bonnet. She named her doll Rosie. One day while playing with Rosie in her room, Emily noticed that the doll's eyes seemed to follow her around the room. She shrugged it off as her imagination and continued to play. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. Emily would wake up in the middle of the night to find Rosie sitting on her bed, staring at her with its cold, lifeless eyes. Emily's parents didn't believe her when she told her about the doll's strange behaviour. They thought she was just having nightmares and told her to go back to sleep. But Emily knew what she saw was real. She confided in her best friend, Lucy, who believed her, and suggested they do some research on the doll's history. They discovered that the doll was made by an old, eccentric woman who lived on the outskirts of town. She had a reputation for being a witch and was rumoured to have cursed the dolls she made. The girls decided to go and confront her. When they arrived at the old woman's house, they were greeted by a dark and eerie atmosphere. The old woman sat in a rocking chair, her eyes staring blankly ahead. She didn't acknowledge the girls' presence, but they could hear her whispering something under her breath. Lucy bravely stepped forward and asked the old woman about the doll's curse. The woman slowly turned her head to face the girls, her eyes now glowing with an otherworldly light. She spoke in a voice that was not her own. "The doll is cursed, and it will bring nothing but misery and death to whoever owns it." The girls were terrified and ran out of the house as fast as they could. They went back to Emily's house and tried to destroy the doll, but it wouldn't break. They then decided to bury it in the woods, hoping that it would never be found again. But the curse was not so easily broken. The doll dug itself out of the ground and made its way back to Emily's house. One night as Emily lay in bed, she heard a soft whisper coming from the corner of her room. She slowly turned her head to see Rosie standing at the foot of her bed, her porcelain hands reaching out to grab her. Emily screamed and ran out of the room, never to return again. The house was soon abandoned and left to decay, but rumours spread throughout the town of a haunted doll that still roams the halls of the old house. Some say that on quiet nights you can still hear the sound of a little girl's screams coming from within. The townspeople warned others to stay away from the house and the cursed doll, but some curious teenagers decided to investigate and found the doll. They took it as a trophy, but soon they realised that the curse is real and the doll brings death to everyone who possesses it. But no one dared to enter the house for fear of encountering the evil spirit that possessed the doll. They say that if you see the doll, you will never be the same again. Beware of the haunted doll named Rosie. Once upon a time, there was a small, secluded town nestled in the heart of the forest known as Ravenswood. The town was known for its eerie atmosphere and dark legends, but it was also home to a clown by the name of Jack. He was a strange and mysterious figure, always seen lurking in the shadows and never speaking to anyone. Despite his strange demeanour, the children of Ravenswood loved him and would often beg their parents to hire him for their birthday parties. As the years went by, the town's inhabitants began to notice that something was off about Jack. Children would disappear shortly after his performances, and strange occurrences would happen in the town. People started to whisper that Jack was a serial killer and that he was using his clown persona as a disguise to lure in his victims. The rumours spread like wildfire, and soon no one in Ravenswood would dare hire him for any event. Feeling shunned and outcast, Jack retreated deeper into the forest. He built himself a small cabin and began to live a solitary life, away from the judgmental eyes of the townspeople. But as the years passed, strange occurrences continued to happen in Ravenswood. People would disappear without a trace, and strange creatures were seen roaming the forest at night. One day, a group of brave townspeople decided to venture into the forest to investigate. They searched for days until they finally stumbled upon Jack's cabin. Expecting to find a madman, they were shocked to find a small laboratory inside. Jack had been experimenting with teleportation technology, but not for the purpose of saving people, but for his own twisted desires. He had been transporting people to a parallel dimension, where he could play with them like puppets, subjecting them to his twisted experiments and twisted desires. The townspeople were horrified and tried to stop him, but it was too late. Jack had already created a portal to the other dimension and stepped through it, disappearing into the abyss of the parallel universe, leaving the townspeople trapped in Ravenswood, with the knowledge that their loved ones were forever trapped in Jack's twisted laboratory, subjected to his sick experiments. They never saw Jack again, but they knew he was out there, somewhere, in another dimension, still playing with his puppets and satisfying his twisted desires. From that day on, the town of Ravenswood was forever tainted by the horrors that had occurred there, and the memory of the clown, Jack, lingered like a bad smell, never to be forgotten. And the townspeople lived in fear and paranoia, never knowing when Jack would return and when his twisted desires would once again threaten the safety of their loved ones. The Eyes of Sadness, a tale of Eyeless Jack. The darkness crept in as the moonlight faded away, leaving the city in a cloak of shadows. Amongst the abandoned streets and empty buildings, there lurked a monster unlike any other. His name was Jack, but he was better known as Eyeless Jack. No one knew where he came from or how he got his nickname, but one thing was certain: he was a killer. His victims were always young women, and he would leave them in the most gruesome of ways, always with their eyes gouged out. The police were baffled by the murders and couldn't seem to catch the killer despite their best efforts. The city was in a state of panic, with people locking themselves indoors at night, afraid to be the next victim. But one woman, a detective named Sarah, was determined to put an end to the reign of terror. She had a personal vendetta against Jack, as her sister had been one of his victims. She spent months researching the case, piecing together clues and following leads, until finally she found him. She tracked him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where he had been hiding. She entered the warehouse, gun in hand, ready to take him down. But what she found inside was something she could never have imagined. Jack was sitting in the corner, his back to her, with a pile of eyes at his feet. He turned to her, his face twisted in a grotesque grin, revealing his own missing eyes. Sarah aimed her gun, but something stopped her. She saw something in Jack's eyes, a glint of sadness, a hint of humanity. She lowered her gun and took a step forward. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack's grin disappeared, replaced by a look of pain. "I see things," he said, Things no one else can see, but every time I see them, they take a little piece of me with them, and I can't stop it. Sarah felt a pang of pity for the monster in front of her. "We can help you," she said. But it was too late. Jack's eyes rolled back in his head and he fell to the ground, dead. Sarah knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. She had finally caught the killer, but at what cost? As she walked out of the warehouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the story, something deeper than a simple killing spree. She would never know the truth, but she would always wonder what could have been if she had just taken that step forward. Camping Trip to Hell. A story of a missing friend and a mysterious lake. The three girls, Sarah, Emily and Rachel, had been planning their camping trip for weeks. They were all teenagers and best friends, and they were excited to spend a week in the wilderness, away from the distractions of their everyday lives. They arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon and set up their tents by a beautiful lake. The sun was shining and the water looked inviting. They spent the first day swimming in the lake and exploring the surrounding woods. But on the second night, things started to take a turn for the worse. Sarah, one of the girls, began to see strange things in the water. She told her friends about it, but they just laughed and brushed it off, thinking she was just imagining things. The next day, Sarah's strange visions continued, and she became more and more convinced that something was wrong. Emily and Rachel grew concerned, but they still didn't believe that actually anything was wrong. That night, while they were sitting around the campfire, they heard strange noises coming from the woods. They tried to ignore them and went to bed, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The next morning, Sarah was missing. Her friends searched for her, but there were no sign of her anywhere. They called for help, and a search party was sent out to look for her, but it was too late. Sarah's body was found floating in the lake, her eyes wide open and staring blankly at the sky. The cause of her death was a mystery. There were no signs of struggle or injury, and the water in the lake was determined to be safe to swim in. But the other two girls knew that something sinister had taken place, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. After Sarah's body was found, Emily and Rachel were in shock. They couldn't believe that their friend was gone, and they couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt for not believing her when she told them about her strange visions. The search party found no sign of any foul play, and the investigation was closed as an accidental drowning. But the girls knew that there was more to the story than what the authorities were saying. They decided to stay and investigate on their own. They searched the woods for any clues, and soon they found some strange footprints around the lake. They followed the footprints, but they seemed to disappear into thin air. They were convinced that something evil was lurking in the woods. That night, they heard strange noises again, and this time they were more intense. They felt like they were being watched. They decided to stay awake and keep watch. In the middle of the night, they saw a figure emerging from the lake. It was a man with an eerie smile. His eyes were completely white. He seemed to be staring right at them, but then he disappeared. The girls were terrified, and they knew they had to leave the campsite as soon as possible. But as they packed up their things, they heard a voice whispering in the woods. It was a voice they recognized. It was Sarah's voice. They followed the voice and found a small cave deep in the woods. Inside the cave, they found a journal. It was Sarah's journal, and it revealed that she had been seeing the man in the lake for days before her death. She had written that he was calling her name and tempting her to come closer to the water. She had also written that she felt like she was being watched and followed. The girls knew that they had to leave the campsite immediately. They didn't tell anyone about the journal. They just left and never spoke of it again. But they knew that they would never be able to forget the events of that fateful trip. Years later, the girls would often think back on that trip and wonder what could have happened if they had believed Sarah and taken her warnings seriously. They were haunted by the memory of their friend's death and the mysterious figure in the lake. They knew that the truth about what happened would always remain a mystery, but they also knew that they would never return to that lake again. The girls had grown up and went on with their lives, but the memory of that week would always linger in the back of their minds, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was still out there, waiting to claim its next victim. Surviving the Skinwalker, a terrifying cabin getaway gone wrong. It was a dark and stormy night when the car broke down on the side of the deserted road. The four friends, John, Sarah, Michael and Emily, were on their way to a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. But now they were stranded with no cell service and no way to call for help. As they were trying to fix the car, they heard strange noises coming from the woods. They brushed it off as just the wind, but deep down they knew that something was not right. Suddenly, they were surrounded by a pack of wolves. The wolves were not like any wolves they had ever seen before. Their eyes were dark and filled with malice. John, the bravest of the group, tried to drive the wolves away by throwing stones at them, but it was no use. The wolves were getting closer and closer, and the friends knew they had to act fast. They quickly piled back into the car and locked the doors, but it was too late. One of the wolves had already managed to get inside. It was a skinwalker, a powerful shapeshifter known for its ability to take on the form of any animal it desired. The skinwalker had taken the form of a wolf and had infiltrated their group. It had been following them since they left the city. The friends were trapped and they knew they had to fight for their lives. They fought bravely, but the skinwalker was too powerful. It killed Michael and Emily, while John and Sarah managed to escape. They ran through the woods trying to find a way out, but the skinwalker was always one step ahead. It chased them through the forest, shifting between animal forms, taunting them with its inhuman powers. Just when they thought they had lost the skinwalker, they stumbled upon a cabin. They quickly barricaded themselves inside, hoping it would be a safe haven. But the skinwalker was relentless. It broke through the door and the final fight for survival began. John and Sarah fought with all their might, but the skinwalker was too strong. In the end, only Sarah managed to escape, while John was killed by the skinwalker. Sarah ran through the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that the skinwalker was still out there, hunting her. She had to find a way to stop it before it killed anyone else. She remembered a story that her grandfather had told her when she was a child about a powerful talisman that could kill a skinwalker. She had to find it. It was her only hope. After hours of wandering, Sarah finally found the talisman. She turned to face the skinwalker and shouted an ancient incantation. The talisman began to glow, and the skinwalker let out a terrible scream as it disintegrated into a pile of ashes. But the victory was bittersweet, as Sarah realised that all her friends were gone, killed by the skinwalker. She left the woods, her heart heavy with grief, but she knew that she had saved countless lives by defeating the skinwalker. The expressionless, insane girl. The Karen story. Once upon a time, there was a young girl named Karen who lived in a small town. Karen had always been a strange and mysterious child. She had a habit of staring at people with a blank expression, and she often spoke in a language that no one could understand. The other kids in town avoided her, and her parents had long since given up trying to understand her. One day, Karen's parents found her wandering the streets covered in blood and holding a knife. They immediately took her to hospital, but the doctors were unable to diagnose her condition. As the days passed, strange and terrifying things began to happen in the hospital. The other patients would often report hearing strange noises coming from Karen's room at night, and some even claimed to have seen her moving around in the room, even when she was supposed to be unconscious. Dr. Allen, the head of the hospital, took on Karen's case, determined to figure out what was wrong with her. He ordered a series of tests and scans, but they all came back normal. He was left with more questions than answers. As the day went by, the hospital staff began to notice that Karen's condition was getting worse. She would often have seizures, and her vital signs would drop, but she would always recover. One night, Dr. Allen was making his rounds and went to check on Karen. He found her sitting up in bed, staring at the wall with a blank expression on her face. Suddenly she turned to him and spoke in a language he had never heard before. Dr. Allen was shocked. He realised that Karen was not just a strange child. She was insane and dangerous. She had killed before, and she will kill again. He knew that he had to do something to stop her. As he tried to understand her message, he was confronted by Karen's family and friends, who were not who they seemed to be. They were also scared of Karen. They revealed that Karen had a history of violence, and they were afraid she would hurt them too. Dr. Allen and the hospital staff fought to protect themselves and others from Karen's wrath, but she proved to be too powerful and too cunning for them. In the end, Karen succeeded in escaping from the hospital and disappeared into the night. Dr. Allen and the remaining survivors were left in shock and grief, realizing that they had unknowingly unleashed a terrible force upon the world, and they knew that they will always be haunted by the memory of Karen and her expressionless face. The end of the story is not happy, as Karen's whereabouts and actions are unknown, and no one knows what she will do next. This story serves as a reminder that sometimes the unknown and the unseen can be more dangerous than we can ever imagine. The Stalker's Letter, a terrifying tale of obsession. The air was thick with tension as Jane sat at her desk, staring at the letter in front of her. It was written in a neat, precise handwriting, and it was addressed to her, but it wasn't from anyone she knew. As she read the words, her heart began to race with fear. The letter was from a stalker, someone who had been watching her every move for months. They knew her schedule, her habits, and even her secrets. They threatened to harm her and her loved ones if she didn't do as they said. Jane's first instinct was to go to the police, but something in the letter made her hesitate. The stalker had included a personal detail that only someone who had been following her closely would know. They had also included a warning that if she went to the authorities, they would make good on their threats. Feeling trapped and alone, Jane decided to take matters into her own hands. She began to gather evidence of the stalker's actions, taking pictures of suspicious cars and people following her, and keeping a detailed journal of their actions. She also started to change her routine, varying her routes to work and avoiding places where she knew the stalker might be watching. But as the days went by, Jane's fear and paranoia grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching her. She became increasingly isolated, cutting herself off from her friends and family. She couldn't sleep at night, and her work suffered. One night, as she was closing up her shop, she heard a noise coming from the back room. Her heart pounding, she cautiously approached, only to find a gift box wrapped in shiny paper. Inside, she found a picture of her, taken from a distance, and a message reading, "I will always be with you." Jane knew she had to act fast. She immediately went to the police and reported the stalker, but it was too late. The next day, her house was broken into and her family was brutally murdered. The stalker had made good on his threats. In the end, Jane was left alone, consumed by guilt and grief. She realised that no matter what she did, she could never escape the stalker's clutches. He had taken everything from her, and there was no happy ending in sight. As she sat alone in her now empty house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She knew that the stalker was still out there, waiting for his next victim, and she couldn't help but wonder who would be next. The Manic Taxi Driver. It was a dark and stormy night, and Mary was stranded at the airport. She had missed her last flight home, and the only option left was to take a taxi. She hesitated at first, but the airport was deserted, and she had no other choice. So she approached the taxi stand and climbed into the first car she saw. The driver was a strange man with beady eyes and a crooked smile. He didn't say a word as he pulled out of the airport and onto the deserted highway. Mary tried to make small talk, but the driver just grunted in response. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him, and she silently cursed herself for not being more careful. As the miles ticked by, the driver's behaviour became increasingly erratic. He swerved in and out of lanes, and his eyes darted around wildly. Mary's heart pounded in her chest, and she knew she had to get out of the car. She tried to open the door, but it was locked. She turned to the driver, begging him to let her out, but he just laughed manically and sped up. Mary knew she was in grave danger, and she began to pray for a miracle. But there was no miracle that night. The driver was determined to add Mary to his list of victims, and he drove faster and faster until the car was nothing but a blur. The last thing Mary saw was the driver's twisted, triumphant grin as the car flew off the road and into the darkness. When the police arrived at the scene, all they found was a mangled wreck and Mary's lifeless body. The driver was never found, and it is said that he still haunts the highways, looking for his next victim. And Mary's family is left to mourn the loss of their beloved daughter, taken by the manic taxi driver on that fateful night.